Some people have been asking what happened in my hand, and it's actually that my coworker told me that I looked too much like Jay, so we had to differentiate. I was weighing that joke versus the fact that I wasn't nervous until Lieutenant Governor Matthew McConaughey came up here and delivered. Okay, both of them. I think a lot of people have given some really amazing talks here and covered a lot of the ground that I would normally cover in an audience that's maybe more general. Since we have a lot of people here that know a lot about this, I'll go quickly through some of this. But my specialization is really in data visualization and doing a lot of custom data visualization, looking at different data sets. So I just want to touch on a couple ideas about data, and then I'll show some of the work that we do to visualize it and hopefully make it more accessible to people. Just as kind of an intro, we're living in a world a lot of people have talked about where there's a lot of promise and a lot of peril with data. There's a lot of data everywhere, and we've seen examples of things like medicine, natural disasters, where it can do a lot of good for us. But at the same time, there's some scary things going on. And we've seen things with the government. We've seen things with corporations such as Target being able to know that you're having a baby before you've told anyone in your family and sending ads. And there was a story about that recently where a girl's father found out, teenage girl, before she told anyone. Credit card companies saying that they can figure out whether you're going to have a divorce before you even know about it. And so in a world of this much data, one thing is that we have to look at all this data and we have to figure out how to turn the raw data and information into information and then into insights and then hopefully into wisdom. And the other thing is that we have to all become a lot more data literate. So let me just say that when we see things like report cards and dashboards, one thing to keep in mind is who created the metrics for that. When we create pieces like that, why is something green versus yellow versus red? Who drew those demarcation lines? I'll talk about this in a second, but when I get to data being truthful, there can be a tendency to trust things just because it looks like data, and we have to be careful. Looking like something is scientific doesn't necessarily mean that we should just take it without being critical. So data not always being useful. You guys may have heard the story about these police scanners that can scan up to something like 3,000 license plates as they're driving by. Police are using these as tools to track down who was in what area when a crime was committed. A very small amount of that data is actually going to be useful. So human beings have to go in and match up that raw data to the applications where it's going to be useful. Most of that information is junk. So sometimes big data evangelists talk about data as if we've got all this information, so it's just going to be super useful to us. Well, when we think of statistics and we talk about signal and noise, signal being the valuable piece of information and noise what we don't need, there is a lot more signal now, but there's also exponentially more noise. So we have to find that signal in the noise. Data is not always truthful. So these guys, you ask them a political question, they're all going to have slightly different answers, even though they might all be experts, because they have different biases, they have different reasons. And it's not just their political backgrounds, which is one of them, but it's also that making bold predictions on television makes you look better than making weak and more nuanced predictions, and no one really holds you accountable if you're wrong. So it's better to go in there and say, I know that Mitt Romney's going to win tomorrow, and then no one really cares in the heat of the moment the next day that you were completely off. But it makes you look stronger. So the other piece about data not always being truthful is that, like I said, I have a friend who's a neuroscientist down at UCLA, and he's told me that they've done studies that if they put a picture of a brain on their presentations, then the credibility skyrockets of how people perceive that. And we see the same thing with data. If you put a graph on there, if you put a chart on there, people are like, oh, wow, this has been measured, this is scientific. I can tell you, I run a design studio, it's not that hard to make a graph or a chart. You shouldn't just believe something because it's in that format. So we all have to become a lot more literate about asking questions, where did data come from, how was it put together, what were the options that were asked there, or we're all going to get hoodwinked by a lot of things out there. This is the other one. Data is not magic. I really like this picture. It's like a wolf with some dragon smoke thing coming out of his hand. That was what came up when I searched magic. You guys may have seen the movie or read the book Moneyball. This is really about the process of sabermetrics, which is using analytics in baseball. And this really transformed Major League Baseball a number of years ago. And they started really looking into a lot of detailed analytics about each player. If you guys haven't seen the movie, it's really fascinating. One thing to notice about it, though, is that they've actually started spending more on scouts in recent years than they have on data analysts on Major League Baseball teams. So that's not to say that they're saying all of this is wrong, but there can be a tendency to believe that this data is just going to take us to these magical insights without the human beings that we need to analyze this and think it through. So it's that mixture of data and the human touch that's really important. And also that data is not a guarantee. There are very few places in the world where there's more data than Wall Street. Despite that, Wall Street rarely gets it right, especially economists. This is a quote from the leading economist at Goldman Sachs. I think people would consider that person pretty reputable in the field. Saying nobody has a clue. It's hugely difficult to forecast the business cycle. Understanding an organism as complex as the economy is very hard. Nobody has a clue. Sorry, this got a little cut off. But in November 2007, these economists said there was basically a 1 in 500 chance of the GDP falling by more than 2%. And it actually fell 3.3% that year. This is a survey of top economists. So this gets really into my field, which is visualizing data. How do we take this raw information and turn it into something that's both engaging and informative to people? This was one of the first infographics we created right at the start of the Arab Spring. We had seen some things happening in Tunisia, and we really were interested in what factors might be causing some of that. And these were just some factors that we picked out from our knowledge of what was going on in the news. And you're actually able to see that if you looked at the ones that had the largest across all these factors, every one of these had some kind of revolution, with the exception really of Iran. And if you're Persian, I apologize. I know Iran is not considered part of the Arab world. We've changed that since. This was another piece we did on unemployment. So we were really curious. Yes, there's been a huge rise in unemployment with the recession, with the Great Recession that happened. But where are those jobs? Which ones are losing, which ones are gaining? And you can start to see things like the green in manufacturing was dropping way back in 2004. It had nothing to do with the recession. It was more of a global shift in the economy. Whereas if you look at things like education and health services, they never dropped once. 2008, 2009, everything's tanking. Look at that one, skyrocketing. So it starts to present a little bit more nuanced view. Okay, I'm being told I better hurry. So this is a really interesting one. So there was a lot of talk about the debt crisis in the United States when a lot of the European countries like Greece and Italy were facing crises. I don't know how many people here ever heard a story about Japan. I never did. Japan has as much debt as the United States, almost the exact same amount. And look at Japan up there as an outlier. So that's the axes there are basically how much debt per person and per GDP. So why does no one talk about Japan if it's got so much debt per person? Well, if you look at the percentages of what they can borrow debt at, Japan is able to borrow money at under 1%. So no one worries about them crashing when they can keep borrowing money at such a cheap rate. But if you look at countries like Greece who have to pay 35%, that's not sustainable. This is one I really like. So this was during the debt ceiling debate. We heard a lot of discussion about did Republicans or Democrats contribute more to the debt? It's a really political issue. I'm often surprised and shocked at the level of dialogue and how unsophisticated it is and undetailed it is. So what we did was we said it's not just the president, right? Congress has a lot to do with the debt. So we brought in who controlled the House of Representatives and who controlled the Senate during all these years. And then instead of, it's really hard to see, but at the top there's basically a hockey stick graph which shows debt if you don't factor it for inflation. And you basically see that, of course, it looks like we're spending far more money than we used to. But if you do it as a percentage of GDP, we actually have less of a debt problem than we did in the 40s. So it provides a little bit more context. And then if you see those little gray bars behind that, that's periods of recession. So what that shows us is that no matter what political ideology is going on, no matter who controls Congress and the presidency, if there's a recession, spending increases. Because that's basic economics. People try to spend their way out of a recession. So we try to provide a little bit more nuanced discussion in the public debate than what we're often hearing. This is another piece we did on second homes in the United States, just showing different layers of information. So again, we're trying to add data density. We want people to be able to look at something and see a lot of information, not just which state has the most second homes, but which has the highest percentage, what's changed over the last 10 years. And then we want to design it in a way that's hopefully going to be really engaging and draw the eye in. And we see a mixture of both. Sometimes we see really data-dense pieces, but they aren't that engaging. And then we see it the other way where it catches your eye and it's really flashy, but there's less information per square inch than if you had just written a paragraph. This is a piece we did on the 2012 budget. What we were focusing on here was there was a lot of debate about cutting the Department of Education, the EPA, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting because, hey, we have a debt problem. We need to handle this. And what you can see here is our total U.S. debt is that big green circle right here. And this tiny dot is the amount of proposed cuts that they were proposing. So we're not saying ideologically we should or shouldn't have those programs. We try to remain neutral on that. But what we're basically saying here is if you're going to make it an economic argument, let's look at the numbers, and it doesn't really hold up as an economic argument. Less data-driven pieces, we also do things like this, describing a process, because that is information too. And we're moving into a world where people are more visually literate. It's a more design-driven world. So we can take very complicated processes or organizations and explain them in much clearer ways. This was a piece we did as an annual report for Volunteer Match, just taking many, many layers of data and trying to simplify that into something that people could grasp. So we basically took one level of metrics as the air, one as water, and one as land. And we spread out all these data points over an actual map and just tried to make it something fun and engaging through in Shamu there. So a couple things to close with. Always investigate the source of the data. You want to know where it's coming from. Have stories in mind as you're digging through it. You want to know what you're trying to accomplish when you go out to get the data. And once you have the data, you want to understand the stories you're trying to tell because it's not going to just jump out of an Excel spreadsheet. There has to be some human insight into it. So look for insights and surprises, especially when you're presenting data to people. Presenting sophisticated data to people about what they already know usually isn't that interesting. Be honest about the data. So we always try to tell the truth, even if it's not telling the story we want. We have to learn why. Make it engaging and beautiful, and make it information rich. Thank you.